Hello, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of MEMO's Weekly Review with me, Nasim Ahmed, and my guest, Mouin Rabbani. Hello, Mouin. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Nasim. It's very good to be with you again. Thank you for having me.
This week, we will be beginning with a discussion on the fallout from Israel's killing of 7 aid workers from the World Central Kitchen. We'll talk about Israel's withdrawal from Khan Yunis in southern Gaza. What's triggered that? And this horrific story about Israel's latest AI system, which generates targets for the Israeli military called the Lavender. It's a horrific story that came out last week, and we'll be discussing that as well. Bombing of the Iranian embassy in Damascus and possible retaliation from Tehran. And the US warns the UN of recognizing a Palestinian state. I mean, why is the US doing that now at this current stage? And we'll be looking at some high profile names that have shifted their position dramatically and are now calling for suspension of arms sales, including Nancy Pelosi and a number of others. So we'll be looking at that as well. But let's begin, Moin. I mean, we are now 6 months into the military operation. More than 33,000 Palestinians have been killed, the vast majority of whom are women and children. 70% of Gaza has been destroyed. So did you think beginning in 7 October, of course, we all expected some form of retaliation. Many of us expected something really brutal and horrific. But did you think on 7 October that the level of destruction that has been caused by Israel and the number of casualties and death that has been caused by Israel would be as high as this? What were your thoughts now, 6 months in? What are your thoughts having witnessed what we've witnessed over the last 6 months?
Well, when I first learned of the Palestinian attacks on southern Israel on the 7th of October, it brought to mind previous incidents. That would have been the Palestinian capture of an Israeli soldier, Gilad Shalit, in 2006, and Hezbollah's cross-border attack that same year, which resulted in, I believe, the death of approximately 8 Israeli soldiers. And Hezbollah managed, I think, to capture 2 others who were assumed to be alive, but we later learned had been killed in the operation. And in both cases, Israel launched a furious response that went on for quite a few weeks and resulted in hundreds, even thousands of deaths. But nothing like this, because 2 things happened. First of all, Israel recognized that it had reached the limits of its ability to inflict damage on its adversaries. And secondly, Israel was called to a halt by its Western sponsors and allies on the basis of this military failure. So, yes, I was expecting a furious and extremely violent and even indiscriminate Israeli response. But I think I'm not alone in being surprised that this went on month after month after month, now for half a year, to the extent that it's being considered genocidal and is subject to a case in the International Court of Justice on the basis that it constitutes a plausible case of genocide. And I think the key issue here has been not so much Israel's actions, but the unconditional support and assistance that Israel has been given in this campaign by the West, primarily by the United States, and in the United States, primarily by President Joe Biden personally, and to a lesser extent by its European allies, the United Kingdom, Germany, and others. In seeking to provide a justification for its initial attacks, Hamas mentioned kind of the marginalization of the Palestine question and the extent to which the West had basically signed on to Israeli unilateralism in its dealings with the Palestinians. And while that may have been a motivation for Hamas, it has also served as an enabling factor since October 7th for Israel, because the same states that had basically authorized Israel to deal with the Palestinians as they wish prior to October 7th have essentially signed on to Israeli genocide after October 7th. And so that would be my first observation as this war now enters its seventh month. My second would be that I think many people, once they recognized that Israel appeared determined to eradicate Hamas, overthrow its government, destroy its military capabilities, and so on, I think most people assumed that if Israel decided and was allowed to continue this for several months, that it would more or less succeed in doing so. We're now more half a year into this, and Israel has still not succeeded. And I think there's a growing consensus that Israel has not only failed, but that its objectives are unattainable. And I think the extent of Israeli incapacity, the extent to which Israel remains a very efficient killing machine, but appears to be a mediocre fighting force when it comes to direct combat with its enemies, has also surprised many people. And I think this will have long-term consequences for the West's willingness to continue sponsoring and enabling Israel as a proxy for their interests in the Middle East, and that Israel may, over time, increasingly become to be seen as a strategic burden rather than a strategic asset. And I think the third thing that will have surprised many people who perhaps were previously not particularly familiar with the Middle East and whose views about this issue were kind of reflected the well-known tropes of, the savage Arabs and the liberal, beautiful Israelis, is just how radical and extremist and to a large extent hysterical is not only the Israeli government, but increasingly Israeli society as well. You have these mass demonstrations of Israeli men, women, and children at the crossing points between Israel and the Gaza Strip, whose sole purpose is to prevent the entry of life-saving aid not to Hamas or Islamic Jihad, but to non-combatant civilian men, women, and children in the Gaza Strip. And these have widespread support within Israeli society.
That's a good summary of what we've seen over the last 6 months. I mean, the striking thing for me is how, having said that Israel will shut off fuel, electricity, and food, and describe Palestinians in a manner which they did, describing them as animals and whatnot, the execution has actually followed the intention. You can map the intentions on top of the way Israel has conducted its operations. So there's a lot there for the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, to see and assess and reach the conclusion which we hope it will. I mean, the latest US member of Congress to say that she believes the ICJ will determine that Israel has actually committed genocide is Senator Elizabeth Warren. In a statement recently, she said that she believes that ICJ will find Israel guilty of genocide. And I think it's very hard to dispute that, given what you've outlined and the fact that the intentions which were expressed at the outset clearly mirrors the manner in which Israel has carried out this operation. It's very hard to see how the ICJ, it may not, of course, but it's very hard to see how the ICJ cannot judge positively as far as the Palestinians are concerned. Sorry, you want to say something?
Senator Elizabeth Warren, if I'm not mistaken, is not only a lawyer, but a former law professor at one of the leading universities in the United States. And surely she must know that in previous cases, the court has set a very, very high bar for determining that genocide has in fact taken place, because genocide is not only about what you do, but about why you've done it. In other words, action and intent. And I think when you look at the statements by Elizabeth Warren and others in similar positions, I think you can look at them in two ways. One way is to say that these are people simply looking at the evidence and drawing their conclusions on the basis of the evidence, which is certainly a legitimate way to look at it. But I think there's also a second perspective through which we should look at such statements, which is that, none are better than politicians who are subject to elections at knowing which way the wind blows. And these are people who, in many cases, have been silent for half a year, or have been in hiding for half a year, or initially came out very strongly in support of Israel, and now all of a sudden are piling on, jumping on the bandwagon. Why is that? Is it simply because they finally figured out what's going on? Or is it because, just as we were talking about Israel making the transition to strategic burden rather than strategic asset, that such politicians are also beginning to see slavish devotion to Israel as no longer an electoral asset and the ticket to political promotion, but are increasingly coming to view and recognize Israel as in fact a burden and an obstacle to their political ambitions. And I think that's a very interesting and important development as well.
But immediately after we finished recording last week, the big story happened, which was the killing of 7 aid workers from World Central Kitchen, 3 of whom were Brits. So a lot has been said since. There's been a massive fallout. And it's not gone unnoticed how the death of 7 Western aid workers is the thing that triggered calls for a suspension of arms sales to Israel from many corners, and not the death of 33,000 Palestinians and counting. What has been your thoughts of the reaction, and also how Israel carried out that operation? I know it's been a week since that happened, but you've been following this, as have many of us. What are your thoughts on the response to that, and also how Israel has conducted the operation?
Yeah. Well, a number of them. First of all, as you just mentioned, if you were to weigh the relevance and importance of this particular incident, precisely as you said, 7 foreign nationals who not only carry foreign citizenship, but are also, white middle-class professionals for the most part. Their killings thoroughly outweighed the genocidal assault on the Gaza Strip that has killed well over 30,000 people and resulted in massive destruction throughout the Strip. That's how the West works. So that would be my first observation. My second would be that this, regardless of how one interprets this, this of course was a horrific event, and regardless of what context one places this in, these people should still be alive and should still be with us, and there is absolutely no excuse for their killing. The third is that one cannot look at this as an incident in the sense of a single missile hitting a vehicle and resulting in the killing of 7 people. What we're talking about here is a series of attacks in which Israel struck a first vehicle, then a second vehicle, then a third vehicle over the course of several minutes, over a distance of something like 2 or 3 kilometers. So it was very clearly a deliberate series of attacks rather than a single attempt, and that makes it impossible to look at this as a operational error. if you will, which is something that could at least be raised as a possibility if we had been speaking about a stray artillery shell that happened to hit a vehicle. Now, Israel has made all kinds of claims in its effort to explain away its actions. One of them is that they believed there was an armed Palestinian in the convoy, which of course there wasn't, and this is kind of the standard operating procedure of the Israelis. But assume that they actually believed that. Once they understood that there wasn't, they kept attacking. And second of all, the Israelis are trying to persuade us that on the one hand, they could make out what they believe to be an armed Palestinian, but were incapable of also recognizing that this is an organization that had been coordinating very closely with the Israeli authorities, that had obtained authorization for this convoy to travel on the road that it did with Israeli approval, that it was clearly marked and identified as a World Central Kitchen convoy. So somehow we're to believe the Israelis completely didn't know about any of the things that they had authorized, but were able to determine that they believed there was a single armed Palestinian in the convoy, and it completely belies explanation. Of course, Israel's flunkies have latched onto this, that this is somehow an honest mistake. Others are saying that Hamas deliberately set up Israel to make this mistake. So even when Israel murders people, Israel is the innocent victim, and it's the evil Palestinians who were responsible. But I do think that it represents a turning point of sorts. Because the founder of this organization, celebrity chef Jose Andres, is someone with a lot more clout than any of the tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians who have been killed over the last 6 months. And he is someone who is, in a sense, within the liberal political establishment in the United States. When he speaks, people listen. His words matter. And I think people have felt genuinely offended that Israel is now doing to, let's say, to them, what they've been doing to the Palestinians for all these months. And let's not forget, this is also an organization that had been, unlike UNRWA, for example, was being openly sponsored and supported by the Americans and to an extent by the Israelis to seek to transform, let's say, the aid environment in the Gaza Strip, to reduce the role of UNRWA and to increase the role of such organizations. And this, of course, threw a monkey wrench into this. Now, that leaves unanswered the question of why did Israel do this? Well, here we have, I think, a difference of insight between the Americans and the Israelis. The Americans would like to replace UNRWA, would like to replace Hamas, would like to replace the current structures in the Gaza Strip with new ones that more closely reflect their own views and interests. The Israelis, by contrast, would like to replace what exists now with nothing, with chaos, with anarchy. And as Norman Finkelstein has pointed out, World Central Kitchen's efforts, whatever one may think of them, represented a hole that needed to be plugged from the Israeli perspective. And that explains why I think the only possible conclusion is that the Israelis knew exactly what they were doing. They were doing this deliberately, and they were doing this for a clear purpose. And that, I think, only increased the outrage in the West. But the Israelis, from their point of view, I mean, one can understand why they acted the way that they have. They have gotten away with literally everything. Their impunity is limitless. No one calls them to account for anything they do. So the question is, why would an Israeli commander, why would an Israeli government official possibly think that murdering 7 staff members of a well-known international aid organization, particularly when it's already killed something like almost 200 other aid workers, why would this be a big deal? Why would anyone care? And I think from Israel's perspective, this is just one more incident that they're going to get away with. And that was really their only miscalculation.
I think you also mentioned in one of your tweets, or was it someone else? I'm not sure. You spoke about why would Israel care? Why wouldn't Israel do it? I mean, the impunity has been going on for decades, but only that in this case, Israel's Western allies have said that Israel will carry out an investigation. So not only are you permitted to kill people in the way they've done, they've also been given the permission to conduct their own investigation and find themselves not guilty of having committed any crime. So when you know that's the culture within which you're operating, then why wouldn't you do the things you're doing? In this case, attacking 7 aid workers.
Well, exactly. I mean, the Israelis appointed a senior military officer, a general, I believe, to conduct what they described as a professional and, more importantly, as an independent investigation. And I likened that to, the Ku Klux Klan appointing its grand wizard to carry out what they would call an independent investigation of lynchings. It's entirely absurd, and a few officers were scapegoated and reprimanded or whatever. But again, this is not about the particular individuals responsible for this attack. This is about the policies that led to this attack, policies which, in my view, made this attack very likely and even inevitable. And Israel, having had the valid assumption that its Western sponsors and allies would react no differently to this attack than they have to any other over the past 6 months, which again have killed more aid workers than in any other conflict on record, which have killed more journalists than in any other conflict on record, which have killed hundreds of medical workers, which have killed something on the order of 15,000 children, and so on. And none of that has mattered. None of that has resulted in a diminishing of unconditional Western support for Israel. So I think Israel acted on the valid assumption that it could get away with this as well.
Let's turn our attention to the withdrawal of Israeli ground forces from Khan Yunis in southern Gaza. So now there's speculation as to why this decision has been taken, especially as the Israeli objective of defeating Hamas has not been achieved. Why would you withdraw at this time? Members of the Qassam Brigade have said that this withdrawal was prompted by the killing of 14 Israeli soldiers. I mean, that's their claim. But there's also speculation that the pullout is a redeployment of troops in preparation for invasion of Rafah. Netanyahu has come out and said that they have set a date for the ground invasion of Rafah, and he's under pressure from his right-wing members of the coalition who have threatened that unless he invades Rafah, they would bring down the government. So in your estimation, what do you think are the main factors that have prompted Israel to pull out from Khan Yunis? Is it preparation for Rafah, or are there other considerations here?
I think there's several explanations for Israel's recent moves. The first is exactly as you've indicated, that Israel has withdrawn troops from one sector of the Gaza Strip to prepare them to invade another sector of the Gaza Strip. In other words, that Israel felt it had reached the limits of its achievements in Khan Yunis. And let's remember, when Israel first went into Khan Yunis, it said, this is where all the Hamas leaders are, and we're going to get them. This is where Hamas's main military infrastructure is, and we're going to destroy that. None of that happened, unless it turns out to be Israeli claims to have killed the Hamas, the deputy leader of the Hamas military wing, Mouin Rabbani, unless those are validated, which we don't know yet. But even that, I mean, let's not exaggerate. It's significant. So one explanation is that Israel is preparing for the next phase of its military offensive, which I wouldn't dismiss out of hand. The other one, and in my view, at least at this point, more likely explanation is that this signals the end of Israel's large-scale ground operations in the Gaza Strip. And there's some background here. First of all, Israel is coming under increasing Western pressure to change the character of its genocidal assault on the Gaza Strip. This has increased perceptibly since Israel's killing of the 7 World Central Kitchen staff, which we were just discussing. Third of all, there have been clear signals from many different quarters that an Israeli ground operation into Rafah would not be accepted and could have consequences. And then there was another development in the last week, which I think strengthens the case that this may signal the end of Israel's ground operations. And that was Israel's attack on the Iranian consulate in the Syrian capital, Damascus, bearing in mind that this was a recognized diplomatic facility and therefore is considered sovereign Iranian territory, basically violating a principle of international relations that Israel's sponsors themselves hold very dear. And that left Iran with 2 options, whether to respond against Israel directly, in other words, launch an attack from Iranian territory onto Israeli territory, with all the potential escalations that could cause, or to do nothing and see any capacity for further deterring Israel that it may have completely evaporate. Now, there have been multiple reports that the way that Iran has responded has been to reach out to the Americans and to clearly inform the Americans that if they bring Israel's war against the Gaza Strip to a clear and definitive halt, that from Iran's perspective, that would obviate the need for a direct Iranian response. And that if the Americans fail to do this, then Iran will feel compelled to respond directly with an attack on Israel launched explicitly from Iranian territory. Now, if there's one policy difference that we've had between Israel and the United States from the very outset of this conflict on October 7th, it has been American opposition to further regional expansion of Israel's war. In other words, they've worked very hard to keep Lebanon out, to keep Yemen out, and now they're faced with the prospect of a direct Iranian-Israeli conflict, which I think many influential decision makers in the US military and even in the US leadership perhaps see as a deliberate Israeli attempt to suck the United States into direct confrontation with Iran, which is something they don't want as a matter of principle, and which is particularly something they don't want during a US election year. And it's against this background that Washington may well have told the Israelis, your war has come to an end. And again, we saw, I should add, after the World Central Kitchen attack, it literally took only one phone call from Biden to Netanyahu to reopen a number of crossings and to see an increase of aid entering the Gaza Strip to a level unprecedented since October 7th. Of course, the day prior to this attack, Israel's flunkies were constantly explaining to us, there has been no attempt to limit aid. The only problem with aid is the inability of the international aid organizations and the Palestinians to distribute it. Now, all of a sudden, they're bragging about allowing greater amounts of aid, which they supposedly weren't blocking. But I digress. The key issue here is that it appears that in the context of the Iranian response to the Israeli attack on their consulate in Damascus, that they have conveyed to the Americans that you either you call off your Israeli attack dogs, or there's going to be significant regional escalation, which you won't be able to ignore.
But let's stick with Iran for a bit. I mean, I was going to get to that later on, but let's expand that conversation slightly a bit more. So you mentioned, the US has been opposed to any kind of regional escalation, and it fears that. And I think the Gulf countries as well so far. I think one of the reasons they haven't really come out as strongly as they have is because I think they believe the war is contained. Israel's killing and massacre is contained within Gaza, and it's in their interest for Hamas to be destroyed. And I think if they feel that this conflict can escalate and broaden regionally, then I think there's a different set of calculations, and it instills fear and anxiety as to what could happen across the region. Another thing I think maybe you can comment on as well, in terms of Iran's response. You mentioned that Iran, instead of responding directly, it's in a sense arguing that if you have a ceasefire, in exchange, we will not attack Israel. That's its position. But could also attacking Israeli, if that doesn't work, could attacking Israeli embassies across the region be another option, given that Iran has a very, I would say, its relationship with the Gulf countries is quite sensitive. Could you imagine, one of the Israeli embassies in Saudi Arabia or Bahrain or UAE, Qatar, or any of the other, Jordan, for example, being attacked in a similar manner? May seem, unrealistic, but is it something that's possible as well?
Well, theoretically, those are all options, but for several years now, there has been a kind of normalization process between between Iran and a number of key Arab states, the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Egypt and Jordan to a certain extent, certainly Qatar, and so on. And so I think while Iran has those options, it would not want to jeopardize one of its key foreign policy achievements, which is a process of normalization with conservative Arab monarchies, on the altar of its conflict with Israel. So, in other words, I think it would want to respond militarily to Israel in a way that does not jeopardize another of its key foreign policies. Now, if it were to attack Israel directly, and this then places these conservative Arab monarchies in a quandary, and having to make choices, perhaps from Tehran's point of view, so much the better, but it would not be seen as directly responsible for threatening or endangering the normalization process. So I think if Iran were to attack an Israeli embassy abroad, it would probably choose, for example, for the Israeli embassy in Baku in Azerbaijan, with which Iran has its own problems going back some time. But again, all the indications that we have, and again, this is based on quite extensive reporting, even though it's always difficult to confirm these reports, is that launch a direct response from Iranian territory on Israeli territory.
Let's turn our attention to one of the other big stories from last week. Details of the manner in which Israel conducts its war. And I think it's what explains why there's such a large death toll in Gaza, 33,000 and counting. So this is a report of an AI tool called Lavender, which generates targets for assassination. According to the report by Plus 972 magazine, there's a 10% chance of failure with the way it generates its targets. And as many as 37,000 targets have been selected in that manner. There was a report the beginning of around, I think, December of another AI generated targeting toolkit called the Gospel. That used to target buildings, whereas this one, Lavender, targets individual human beings. And when I read that, first, of course, it was really shocking to see the process in which Israel makes a decision in carrying out its execution and targeting its targets in Gaza. But when I read that, I couldn't but help. This is just another example of the battle-tested weapons that Israel develops through its occupation and bombardment and killing of Palestinians. And these are battle-tested weapons which are then sold onto the global market to the dictators and autocrats who see those weapons as the must-have gadgets to continue their brutal suppression of the populations. That was my thought. What was your thought and your understanding of how this AI system works and how this could be deployed, not just in Palestine against Palestinians by the Israelis, but elsewhere as well?
Yes, I had several responses to this article. This was a very thorough investigative report written primarily by the Israeli investigative journalist Yuval Abraham for the Israeli website Plus 972 magazine, as you mentioned. And given the way it was produced, I think it's a fair assumption that this is a report that had to pass through Israel's military censorship regulations, and that there may well be additional significant aspects to this story that were not published, that were prohibited from publication. So that would be my first observation. My second observation is that you mentioned this being a battle-tested software application that Israel will now start to market worldwide. I think that's entirely correct. I also don't think Israel is going to have that much success marketing this, because if this is a software application that is intended to make military operations more effective and more efficient, and it has been a cornerstone of Israel's campaign in the Gaza Strip, then why 6 months later is the second order militia that is facing the most powerful military in the Middle East still standing on its feet and operating coherently and launching deadly attacks on Israeli occupation forces? In other words, it has proven to be quite ineffective in terms of meeting its main objectives, which is eliminating senior and junior operatives of Hamas. The third is that you mentioned Lavender. So there are, in fact, two software applications that this article discussed. The first is Lavender, which looks at the behavior of individuals to determine whether or not they may be low-level Hamas operatives, and concluded that based on, the Gaza Strip is probably the most intensely surveilled territory on earth. And by looking at people's behavior in terms of their interaction with cell phones, with movements, with text messages, with social media, and all these things. Lavender put together a target bank of 37,000 individuals that it determined were at one level or another, primarily lower level members of Hamas. Clearly, it had a huge margin of error. I think that the article claims it was a 10% margin of error. It was obviously very much higher, given the realities on the ground, that Hamas is still operating coherently and so on. Then there was a second application called Where is Daddy? And that sought to eliminate these 37,000 people, not by trying to locate them on the field of battle, but deliberately prioritizing attacks on them when they were in their own homes, knowing full well that attacking them at those locations would result in the killing of their families, in many cases of the inhabitants of an entire apartment building or a home. So it was almost designed to inflict maximum killings of the civilian population, to an extent that I think it would be fair to say this was not software that sought to target Hamas operatives with a much higher threshold of civilian collateral damage. I think it would be fair to describe this as a software application that was targeted at the families and neighbors and other civilians, in which you could almost say that it was the presumed Hamas activists, who in many cases weren't, but that the presumed Hamas activists were, in a sense, the collateral damage. And that the main target, given the nature of the software and the way it was applied, was to eliminate the families and neighbors and other civilians in these locations. So if Israel is going to present this software to the International Court of Justice when it eventually holds its full hearings, as evidence that it was really targeting Hamas and not the civilian population, I think any serious reading of the way the software operated would have to conclude that it was designed for the maximum elimination of civilians, using the presence of members of Hamas solely as a pretext of the way it was implemented. And again, the other observation, just to repeat, is that it has failed. And so, the head of Israel's Signals Intelligence Unit, 8200, I can't remember his name, but this guy is so hopelessly incompetent that his identity is supposed to be a top secret, except he forgot to hide his tracks when he published a book and tried to promote it on Amazon. If he really thinks, he's presenting this as a revolution in military affairs, and if he's going to start marketing this now after he leaves the army to pad his nest egg, he's going to have some very serious questions to answer. Why didn't it work? Why did it take you 6 months and you're still failing? Again, I would not want to be an Israeli military salesman, because the first question they're going to be asked is, how can you guarantee this is going to work better for us than it did for you?
I guess if you are an authoritarian thinking of buying this AI tool for targeting your population, Israel's conduct is probably an example of how not to conduct warfare if you don't want to be dragged into the ICJ. That's what the last 6 months has shown.
And I'm sure there are people who are going to say, look, if it's going, if the price we have to pay for eliminating our enemies and achieving total and unconditional victory is a genocide case in the International Court of Justice, so be it. I'm sure there are people who look at it that way. Israel's problem is that on the one hand, it now has this case at the International Court of Justice, but it doesn't have the military victory to compensate for it.
And not only that, it doesn't have the support it once did. Israel has become a pariah state, and that's become headline news in many Western outlets.
Yeah.
Even The Independent in the UK, one of the first to, I would say, break ranks and say enough is enough, stop. So it lost its allies, and when it looks back and sees the point at which Israel lost the hearts and minds of its allies in the West. Of course, this genocide in Gaza is what would have tipped the balance in Palestine's favor.
Yes, I think it's been a process. You look at, for example, the 1982 invasion of Lebanon, culminating in the Sabra Shatila massacres. You look at the first Intifada, you look at the second Intifada, you look at the previous Israeli assaults, onslaughts on the Gaza Strip, and then you look at what's been happening the past 6 months. I don't think that it has been a sudden and dramatic shift that emerged in a vacuum. I think it's been a cumulative process in which clearly the past 6 months have had an outsized impact and influence. But I think in many cases, people were predisposed to begin looking at Israel differently, given what they've seen and known about Israeli policies and conduct over recent years, and for older people over recent decades. You add to this the consensus among all major Palestinian, Israeli, and international human rights organizations that Israel is an apartheid state, and so on, and the transition from indifference or qualified support for Israel to opposition to it is not as big a leap as is being made out to be often.
So let's turn our attention now to the international stage, where there's an ongoing effort by the Palestinians requesting full membership of the UN. They're renewing this again this week. The US has opposed that. They insist that this is not the place to recognize Palestinian state. It has to be through some kind of through the bilateral negotiation. And not only that, the US has legislation to punish or cut off funding to the UN or UN agencies that grant full membership to the state of Palestine. The question is, though, I mean, why is the US able to do this in this regard? Because there are 140 countries that recognize the state of Palestine. So what is preventing the accession of Palestinian state to the UN as a member state? Is it simply just US opposing this, or are there other factors? Because, as I said, 140 countries already recognize the state of Palestine.
Well, my understanding is that for the state of Palestine to become a full member state of the United Nations, what is required is a majority vote in the General Assembly. But for the General Assembly to be able to hold that vote, Palestine's membership has to be referred to it or recommended to it, if you will, by the Security Council. And if one of the permanent 5 veto-wielding members of the Security Council prevents the council and its membership committee, or whatever it's called, from referring that file to the General Assembly, then a vote is not going to be held. And in this case, yes, the Americans say that they would like to see a Palestinian state, but they want to see this emerge as a result of bilateral negotiations. It's complete hogwash. The Americans routinely vote against General Assembly resolutions reaffirming the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. By saying they want it as a result of bilateral negotiations means we will only accept a Palestinian state if the Israelis agree to it, because bilateral negotiations means that Israel has a veto over the establishment of a Palestinian state. And the Americans know better than anyone that Israel is fundamentally, principally, categorically opposed to a Palestinian state. So you can't possibly make the point that you support a Palestinian state but want this Palestinian state to be established on the basis of negotiations with Israel. What you're really saying is, I don't want a Palestinian state because I'm giving Israel a power of veto. And I know Israel is opposed to it, but I don't want to come out openly and say I oppose Palestinian statehood. So instead, I will say I support a Palestinian state, but only if those who categorically reject one agree to it. It's complete nonsense.
And another key development, I think, is just the sheer level of opposition that we're seeing in countries like US, UK, and Germany as well. In the UK, since the killing of these 7 aid workers, there's been a massive call to suspend arms sales. And officials working in the Department of Business and Trade, they've threatened to stop working over UK arms sales to Israel. And the argument here is that, they don't want to be indicted for aiding and abetting genocide. And as we know, following orders in the case of genocide is not really a defense. And this
Yes,
is what
that's an
many.
issue that was resolved in the late 1940s of the previous
That's
century.
right, and that's what they are fearing. We mentioned Elizabeth Warren, but the one that's really surprised me is in the US, 40 Democratic representatives, including Speaker Nancy Pelosi, they signed a letter calling on Biden to stop offensive arms sales to Israel. And this is Pelosi, who described pro-Palestinian activists as having ties to Russia. So she's probably jumping on the bandwagon, who knows? But how significant is that?
I think it's very significant when you lose someone like Nancy Pelosi, who's been an Israel flunky her entire political career. What it means is that these are people who are, in a sense, professional opportunists who recognize that the winds are changing and are getting with the program in order to secure their personal and political advantage. Let's not pretend any of these people have principles. Their support for Israel was never based on principles. Any opposition to Israel, support for the Palestinians, is not going to be based on principles. These are people who make calculations about what is best for them personally and politically. And when you get people who have spent the last 300 years of their careers, as would be the case with Nancy Pelosi, kowtowing to Israel, suddenly coming out in opposition to it, then you know something significant is changing in the United States among the American electorate. And there are polls that demonstrate that this shift is underway and is underway at an accelerating pace.
Sorry, I was going to add that to another point. You can continue, but adding your thoughts to this question as well, related to President Biden, who gave an ultimatum to Israel last week. He said that we won't be able to support you anymore. And but the question is, I mean, do you think this is really a genuine threat of the Israelis? Because it's, to many of us, it seems like these differences are really differences in tactic, not really in strategy. And the strategy has always been to create, I would say, greater Israel. And as one commentator put it, what the West is really opposed to is this expedited genocide that we are seeing in Gaza, and not this slow motion genocide of Palestinians over many, many decades. So they're not really opposed to the overall strategy of Israel, but really the manner in which Israel is going about conducting its what was a slow motion genocide, to a full-blown genocide, as we are seeing in Gaza.
Yes, I mean, when you listen to the differences that have emerged between Biden, Blinken, Netanyahu, Ben Gvir, these are not arguments about matters of principle. These are debates about what is best for Israel. The Americans think Israel is not serving its best interests, and that Israel, in order to secure its best interests, should modify its conduct. I think that needs to be clear, that this is not a debate about Israeli versus Palestinian rights. Absolutely not. Certainly not with the crew in charge in the White House and the State Department. It's about what's best for Israel. And the Palestinians, as far as these people are concerned, again, and I've said this before, are irrelevant and expendable human scum. It's really, and the second issue is, to what extent is Israel serving or obstructing U.S. regional and geopolitical interests? So that's what the debate is about. But just as we've been speaking about shifts in Western public opinion, you mentioned British civil servants, I believe, at the Department of Trade, indicating, they don't want to expose themselves to legal liabilities in terms of any decisions they make about trade, and particularly the arms trade with Israel. Well, we've also seen reports in recent days that morale at the U.S. State Department is today lower even than it was on the eve of the illegal U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. So imagine that there is more dissent within the U.S. State Department about their government's role in aiding and abetting a genocide by a foreign ally than there was to a crime of aggression by their own government 2 decades ago.
But before we finish, what should we be keeping our eyes out for next week? I know there's an ongoing case with Nicaragua filing a case against Germany in the ICJ. What else are you looking forward to seeing next week?
I think a key thing to look at is an issue that we've discussed today, and that is whether or not Iran responds directly to the Israeli attack on its consulate in Damascus, and if it doesn't, whether we see a breakthrough in the negotiations that are being conducted now in Cairo about a ceasefire and a exchange of captives between Israel and Hamas. My sense is that if there is no attack in the coming days, that's an indication that the Iranians believe they've received a positive U.S. response, and that would be reflected in significant progress, if not agreement, in the Cairo negotiations, and that may mean we've reached the beginning of the end of this horrific past half year. Alternatively, if the Israelis still believe that, and I think they would be right to believe that they only need to worry about Western actions and can safely ignore any verbal reprimands or statements that come out of Washington and London and Brussels. If on that basis they do launch a ground operation in Rafah, which again I consider unlikely, and continue escalating in Lebanon, then I think all bets are off.
That was my guest, Mouin Rabbani. Thank you, Mouin. And
thank you very much.
Thank you for tuning in. See you next week for another episode of MEMO Review with me, Nasim Ahmed. Bye-bye.